Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Wildlife Protection Club's first podcast. My name is Molly, and today we are talking to Sasha Tuttle. Sasha is the former president of the Wildlife Protection Club and a current graduate student at UBC studying the effects of wildflower strips in blueberry field edges on pollinator diversity and crop yield. Welcome, Sasha. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your research? What are the questions you're trying to answer?
Right. My my research has quite a few questions we're trying to tackle. I guess starting from the conservation side of it, we want to know if having a wildflower strip on the edge of a blueberry field will attract wild pollinators, and if so, how long does it take to attract the wild pollinators? The span of the research is only 2 years. We also want to know if the wild pollinators we'll be attracting is a diverse community or if we'll only be attracting a few select species. And then in turn, we want to know if by attracting these wild pollinators, we'll be increasing the ecosystem service of pollination to the blueberry crops and if that will increase the crop yield and crop quality. And we're measuring crop quality in terms of the firmness of the blueberries, their shelf life, sugar acid ratio, and then we're also thinking about measuring some other nutrient related factors like antioxidant levels.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty far in developing the protocol, but there's still a little bit of wiggle room. The actual procedure isn't going to start until late April, early May.
Sounds really cool. That's awesome. What personally sparked your interest in this topic?
Well, interestingly enough, my background is largely with amphibians and reptiles. I worked with Oregon spotted frog and turtles beforehand, or sorry, Western painted, no, yes, Western painted turtles.
Yeah.
I've really just been interested in anything conservation, wildlife ecology related since I was a kid. I have an indigenous background. I'm from Sumas First Nation, and my father brought me up to have a really deep respect and understanding for our environment. So after working in the field with Fraser Valley Conservancy and some other organizations, I ended up in a research lab, Agassiz Research Center, where I worked with parasitoid wasps and stink bugs. It was a biocontrol lab.
Mm-hmm.
And after I worked with them and my contract came up, I mentioned to my advisor or supervisor that I was interested in graduate studies. And he recommended me to Claire Kremen, who is my current supervisor at UBC. And her whole lab just works on how we can make working lands, as they call them. So lands for farming, lands with housing, just lands that humans are currently using, how we can make them more sustainable or environmentally friendly.
That's awesome. Sometimes it's interesting just seeing how, you take one path and where it leads you, and maybe you started out with more of the wildlife side and, pollination. It's all interconnected, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
pretty cool.
And I definitely think that because I came from Chilliwack and we have so much farming going on in the area with blueberries and with dairy farming, it was fate. One thing led to another.
Yeah, it's definitely relevant to the location that you're in.
Hmm.
Can you just tell our listeners like a few more reasons why pollinator diversity is an important thing?
Oh, absolutely. So, from a farming perspective, the way it works with plants, right, is that not all plants require pollen to produce fruit, but most do. And even if they don't require pollen to produce fruit, if they get it from a genetically diverse source, so like from another variety of the same species or from just a more distantly related relative or a distantly related individual, then it can lead them to invest more into their fruit. So they could have more resources in the form of larger fruit or just more fruit, more seeds, because that offspring could be considered more fit or just better off than a less genetically diverse offspring, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally.
And the way that farmers introduce pollinators into their field or attract them isn't just through having the blueberries there. It's not just through their presence. They actually pay to have managed honeybee hives at the edge of their fields.
Yeah.
So this is a big cost to the farmers, and we're actually seeing a lot of harm coming to the honeybees in recent years, just in forms of parasites and disease. So they're becoming a lot harder to manage. And it doesn't even end there. It's so interesting because blueberry plants, they actually require something called buzz pollination to release their pollen, and honeybees aren't even capable of that. So they can still get the pollen out, but not as much as an insect capable of buzz pollination.
Yeah, like bumblebees, right? They do the buzz pollination, is it?
Yeah, exactly. So farmers are putting out so much money into these managed honeybee hives that aren't even like really feasible for the future. Um, and the honeybees aren't as effective at collecting this pollen and pollinating the flowers as our wild bumblebees are.
Hmm. And I've heard this, but maybe you can confirm. Like, is it also true that those, commercial honeybee hives can kind of put a stress on the native bees by kind of outcompeting them for some of the, the food out there?
Mm, I haven't done a lot of reading in that area, but I think there was a paper that just came out that basically confirmed what you're saying and says that it was. I I haven't read it yet, but my lab member shared it with me, and it
Mhm.
essentially said that having managed honeybees on a farm or in an area can reduce the diversity of the wild pollinators present, and it is likely through competition for resources.
Yeah, and sometimes like what I've noticed is just sometimes we do things we don't fully understand, and then we only learn the negative repercussions later. So nature knows best, I guess.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
what are the major factors threatening pollinators? Like you did touch on a few just there, but is there any like specific to the Fraser Valley, like things that are kind of threatening the pollinators out there today?
Oh yeah. One major thing that's harming them is pesticides. So a big pest in the Fraser Valley is this little fruit fly called the spotted winged Drosophila, and it actually can lay its eggs in fruit before it rots. It lays its eggs in ripe fruit,
Oh,
and this will destroy the fruit before it can even make it to the market. And so the farmers having to deal with this will spray their crops with pesticides once a month, however frequently. And this is really harmful to the bees. It'll kill them. Another thing is that bees require like to sustain a diverse pollinator community, you need a diverse floral bed. You need diverse floral resources for a couple of reasons. Some bees are specialists and they will only collect pollen from one species. Like we have one in the Fraser Valley that only collects pollen from snowberries.
hmm.
Um, and other bees are generalists, but they will still want a varied pollen source because different plants will have different nutritional values and they need different proteins and I think it's carbohydrates or some other nutrient for their colony, like for their offspring.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I think those are the two major ones. So pesticides and then just the lack of floral resources and nesting resources too. They actually need grass, depending on the species, they need different resources to make their nests.
Right. Do you know, is there any farmers in the Fraser Valley that are currently using wildflower strips for that purpose? Or maybe there's some that just happen to have wildflower strips and are getting that kind of benefit that you're looking at, or is it pretty uncommon?
As far as I know, it's a pretty uncommon practice. I haven't seen any like in my driving throughout the Fraser Valley. I haven't. We do have three farmers who are willing to work with us right now and who are planning to plant a flower strip next year for the research, but I don't know of any who already have that. The
Okay.
problem is that there are costs that are incurred with establishing a wildflower strip because and there's also concerns that depending on the flowers in the wildflower strip, if they bloom at the same time as your blueberry crop, then they might be attracting pollinators away from your crop and then reducing your yield. That's
Mm,
one concern. Um, Another is that after you've already paid the money to establish this wildflower strip, you have to put in money to weed it and manage it so it doesn't spread into the field and then compete with your crop.
Right.
Um, yeah, and I mean, farmers just they have such busy lives. I don't even think that it's feasible for them to go out and hand weed these flower strips. Like they're more likely to spray herbicides on it,
Right.
which calls
Right.
into question how effective it'll really be.
That is a good question. Like if depending on what you find in your research, I guess, do you think in the future, like next steps, if it was showing promising results, do you think farmers would be open to the idea of a new practice like this? Do you think they'd be receptive?
I certainly hope so. I don't think that after the research is complete, if we do find the positive results we're hoping for, I don't think it will take off without financial incentives. Because the problem is that the farmers have to come up with the initial funds to establish the wildflower strip. And if it takes years or even more than 2 years to see the benefit of the additional pollinators and the additional yield, then they're going to need some additional funds to make up for that time period, like for the costs incurred during that time period before they see a profit.
Hmm.
That would be my biggest concern. And then the other thing is that farmers don't have access to our research findings. So I would um, I would hope that we would share them with the Agassiz Research Center, and then a knowledge transfer officer there would spread the news to the farmers and hopefully inspire them to take on these practices.
Yeah, that's where like the connection between kind of the academic side and the more practical application side then needs that kind of liaison type person somewhere to really make it, worth your time, like the work that you're doing. Um,
Right.
yeah. hmm But I mean, do you think this could maybe, your findings could also translate to other things like maybe other crops or, I mean, people in their own backyards, things they could do depending on what you find to support pollinators?
Yeah, I do think that our research could definitely add value to, or it could definitely serve as evidence for other crops that require buzz pollination. I can't name any off the top of my head, but in terms of relating our findings or our research to just people's own backyards, I think there is already significant research out there that says if you want to support a diverse pollinator community, the best thing you can do is have a diverse garden. Even if all of the plants in your garden are introduced species that you purchased from a nursery, if you have a different number of species, it is more likely you're going to be helping generalist pollinators on top of niche specialist pollinators.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So it's more diversity is the key to it.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's pretty cool. If somebody like wanted to get started in their backyard and right now they just have like Bermuda grass, totally flat, like how would you recommend someone would go about doing that?
That's an excellent question. The thing with grass is that most grass lawns aren't like the grass on the lawn isn't even native to this area. That's an introduced species. And because the species native to here haven't evolved with the grass in our lawns, it doesn't serve them much of a purpose. It's not useful to them. So I would say you could do a garden box, like an elevated box with wood, and then you could plant your flowers in there along with your crops. Um, you could just set out a piece of your lawn for a small flower bed, as long as you're not spraying it with pesticides or anything.
Hmm.
Um, if you're looking for native plants and you're in the Fraser Valley, I do know that Fraser Valley Conservancy does a fundraiser every year where they sell native plants. If you choose to put native plants in your garden, there may be a higher chance that you'll be aiding the native species in the area because they have evolved with those plants. And you'd also be helping the Conservancy put aside funds for conservation of other at-risk species.
Yeah, that's so awesome. I did get some plants from their sale last summer and they're doing really well in my backyard. So I can definitely attest to that being a good source.
That's
And
awesome.
yeah, and like, I mean, we're getting a little bit away from wildflowers, but like we were saying, things are all interconnected. Like, what do you think are a couple other benefits of having some native plants in your backyard. You mentioned like you might be helping some other species. I don't know if you could kind of build on that a bit.
Right. Um, well, I think uh, having a diverse flower bed in your garden would primarily be helping pollinators. We have to keep in mind, though, that actually bumblebees aren't the only, or sorry, bees in general are not the only pollinators in the Fraser Valley or in general.
Mhm.
Butterflies do some limited pollination, not as much as we actually think they do. It's a little bit of a old wives' tale. Flies, flies pollinate. I think it's primarily hoverflies, but I'm not entirely sure. Um, yeah, I'm just trying to think. Depending on like if you have a fruiting species, so a species that produces flowers and fruit, you could be helping other insects. Um, if you have, maybe a raspberry plant or something, salmonberry plant in your yard, that could definitely translate into food for possums, raccoons, skunks.
Mhm. Yeah, like even birds.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
That's pretty cool. I think there's seems to me like there's growing interest in that, specifically in the Fraser Valley, like us being so connected to wildlife all around us, and if we just put a little bit in our backyards, kind of can create corridors. People seem to
Yeah.
be interested.
Yeah, absolutely. That there's actually a really big field of research right now that's trying to answer the question of how can we best aid, like, would it be better for us to aid conservation by putting aside more protected areas or by creating corridors between those protected areas? And
Mhm.
from what my professor has been telling me and other researchers, the answer is yes. It's let's do both. So and there is huge potential for working lands, so in farmland and for people's backyards to be turned into corridors for our native species just by creating more natural resources for them.
Totally makes sense. Um, do you know, like, for someone living in a small space, like an apartment, and they just have like a windowsill type of thing, maybe a small patio, like, do you think that they could do something to help as well?
Yeah, I mean, every little bit counts, even if you just have a few potted plants on your porch. I don't see you. Why not?
Yeah, totally. Is there any like wildflowers if someone was going to go out and buy, a packet of seeds? Um, Anything that you would suggest avoiding, like any terms of invasives, that someone might accidentally plant in their yard?
Yeah. Oh, that's a very good question. So if you go to a grocery store or a nursery, I think that your chances of coming across like purchasing an invasive plant species is limited. I don't remember the legalities of it, but I'm pretty sure that nurseries in the Fraser Valley have an agreement to try and limit invasive plant sales. Um, but what you have to watch out for, if you're not sourcing them from a nursery, like say you're purchasing your plants on an online marketplace or off some person on the side of the road, just something that's not a licensed store, um, then your chances of accidentally purchasing an invasive plant species, which is going to be a huge pain in the butt for you later, is much higher. A few common ones that I could definitely say you want to avoid are Himalayan blackberry. I know a lot of people would like that one for the fruit, but actually, Himalayan blackberry is known to host the spotted wing Drosophila I was talking about earlier.
Right.
So if you buy that plant and put it in your backyard, yes, it will flower and yes, you will get fruit, but it will very likely be invested or infested with maggots.
And it might take over your backyard and make a thorny mess that is horrible
Oh,
to deal with.
yeah, absolutely. Oh, another one that's quite popular. People love this plant because it grows tall and it has this big, beautiful yellow flower is yellow flag iris.
Yeah.
That one chokes up waterways. It ruins wetland habitat. It is just a terrible plant. I think you would be most likely to find some individual selling that on, unbeknownst to the fact that it's invasive. So I watch out for that.
Hmm.
Um, I can't think of others off the top of my head, but if you're interested in learning more about invasive plant species in the Fraser Valley, you could always look at the Invasive Species Council of BC website. There's also, I think it's called a Fraser Valley Invasive Species Society. They both have resources where you can learn more about which plants to avoid and how to identify them.
Yeah, that's definitely a good thing to check out. One that just popped in my mind is Morning Glory. It's also
Oh,
really pretty, like has those white flowers. It's a vine, but it's ferocious and
hmm
it is very hard to get rid of.
hmm
Yeah, so there's lots, and yeah, definitely like I don't know. I think it's good to do your research, but if you're trying to make your backyard more like hospitable place for pollinators or just like wildlife in general, like that's the most important thing. Like that's great that people are trying to do that just to begin with. But
Yeah, and I mean, if you're strapped for time or you're a little bit unsure about which plant is which, it's always safer to just go to the nursery or to the Fraser Valley Conservancy plant sale, although that is only once a year, I think.
maybe twice now. I think they do one in the fall.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, but yeah, that's so true. Just consult with someone who knows. Yeah.
hmm
So, anything else you'd like to add? Any kind of final thoughts?
Um,
Putting him on the spot there.
that's
But
okay. No, I think I'm just yeah, it bums me out when I pass by these strips and strips of people with lawns with no flowers or like just a couple of ferns. And I think that if we as a community came together and invested in creating a more biodiverse city, we could really aid some of our at-risk species and we could really aid the pollinator community that is struggling from our impacts.
mhm,
Um, so yeah, I'm just happy to get the message out there.
that actually just popped something in my mind. What do you think about early in the season when people want to mow their lawns? Like, should they wait for the pollinators to have a chance to get to the dandelions and, those first little weeds, or does
Oh
it
yeah.
matter? Yeah.
Yeah, no, the typical weeds that use, I always, I usually avoid using the term weed because a weed, a weed in your garden is just any plant you don't want in the garden. It doesn't necessarily mean that the plant will quickly take over or spread far. It's a common term. An invasive plant is one that has been introduced to the area that will definitely take over and is difficult to get rid of and has negative consequences for the environment. So my advice to those people is don't see the dandelion as a weed. It's if you leave it there and you give the pollinators a chance to reach, well, the pollen and the nectar, if it produces nectar, I'm not sure about that one. Not all flowers do, but all flowers, as far as I know, produce pollen because that's their means of reproduction.
Right.
Um, yeah, like if you leave it, you will give the bees a chance to get at those resources. Another consideration for when you're building your pollinator garden is that it's always good that you have flowers that bloom in like sequentially. You want the flowers to bloom one after the other so that there will be a resource available to the pollinators all summer. That is the most efficient, high quality pollinator garden you could build.
Right. Yeah, just consistent food for them.
Right, because you have to keep in mind that not all flowers are going to bloom at the same time, and not all flowers will bloom throughout the whole summer.
Right. Yeah, and like dandelions, I mean, there's other benefits to them as well. Like I know that you can use their leaves in salads and things.
Oh
So
yeah.
just do like a rebrand of dandelions. They're they're not a weed.
No, no, they're actually a very high source of vitamin C. They carry a lot of nutrients. They're just a bit bitter.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thanks, Sasha, for taking the time to tell our listeners about your important work. I'm really interested to hear what your research finds. And thanks to all our listeners who tuned in.
Yeah.
If yeah, if you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe to our channel, learn more about ways in which you can help protect local wildlife.